Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Margolin. I'm part of the planning committee. I'm watching the numbers grow as people come in, so I just wanted to give another minute for people to come in. You are in the right place. This is the Mid-Symposium Plenary. It's called Critical Race Theory and Critical Pedagogy Librarianship, Intersections, Explorations, and Practice. And the numbers are still rising. We're at almost 200 folks in here with us. So I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping. A reminder to keep your camera and mic off during the presentation. Please feel free to utilize the chat feature with any questions, and we've had very active chat features in other sessions, so please jump in with that. The presentations are going to go for about 60 minutes with 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. This session is being recorded. There's a live captioner for this one, so we should have very excellent captions. If there are any technical issues, captions or otherwise, Hafiza is on to do the tech stuff for us today. And please make sure that you've viewed our code of conduct. I think that's all the things, but there are still more people coming in. So I don't know, Symphony, if you want to start right away or give it another minute. But I will turn it over to Symphony to get us started. Thank you.
No, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. The first thing I'm going to do is just to put our slides into the chat. If Hafiza or somebody else can repost these as the numbers grow, I'd really appreciate it. But our slides are there, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all to get us started. Hi, everyone. My name is Symphony. I'm coming to you from Lenape Lands in what is now New York. Thank you so much for coming to our Mid-Symposium Plenary. We are 4 librarians who share the title of Critical Pedagogy Librarian at our respective institutions. Critical pedagogy as an ethic, as an area of study, or as like a movement in our field has obviously been growing for some time now, many, many years. And everyone's amazing radical work has led us to today, where critical pedagogy is being institutionalized in our workplaces and for us through our positions. In our session today, we're going to use some of the tenets of critical race theory to understand and analyze our positions, but also to reflect our research, teaching, and practice. While we hold very similar titles, our jobs do vary. We work with different populations. So we're going to begin by introducing ourselves and telling you a bit about our work. So again, I'm Symphony Bruce. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the critical pedagogy librarian at the New York University Division of Libraries. I work in a department called Undergraduate Instruction Services. And that means that I provide mostly instruction to first-year students or sort of otherwise novice groups of learners, like orientations and things like that. I work with first-year seminars, like writing 101 classes, first-year writing classes, and the like. But the instructional services aspect of our department means that we also are designed to support all of those who teach within the libraries in any capacity. And that means that we provide and house teaching materials. We form communities of practice, and we run communities of practice, or even sort of consultation and observation to improve teaching skills. And I'll pass over to Jamila.
Hi, I'm Jamila Gabriel. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Critical Pedagogy Research Librarian within the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. My role is providing instructional and research support, of course, but also learning design for faculty, as well as working with staff and leading efforts around critical pedagogy and working with students as well.
Hi, I'm Robin G. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am the Critical Pedagogy and Equity Librarian at Cornell University. I work at the Albert R. Mann Library, which serves the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and the College of Human Ecology. So I provide instructional and research support to undergraduate and graduate students within those colleges. I also do research or outreach work, particularly to historically underserved groups, including first generation and low income students.
Hello, I'm Tova Johnson. Pronouns are she and her. And I'm the Critical Pedagogy and Research Librarian at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. And I support health sciences graduates and professional students, faculty, staff, and researchers at the university, and also community and non-affiliated health professional users of the library. So in my role, I identify, review, and recommend critical pedagogy approaches to inform library-wide instructional practices, in addition to my reference, instruction, and outreach work. And I've also worked collaboratively with units across campus to forward critical pedagogy approaches. And then finally, I also teach 2 term-long courses on searching and information management through critical frameworks.
So the questions that we will muse upon during this plenary are, what is a critical pedagogy librarian and what do we do? And what does it mean to apply criticality and maybe even radicalism to our positions at neoliberal institutions? And how does critical race theory help us make sense of our positions and critical pedagogy?
So we'll talk about what critical pedagogy librarianship is to provide some more context about what we do. So we've listed here those characteristics of our jobs that we have in common. But all of these aspects will play out in our roles in different ways, depending on our particular context. And I'll also point out that these are characteristics that you'll find of the work of other librarians who are engaging in critical pedagogy, but may not have the critical pedagogy librarian title. All right, so what are the primary characteristics of our position? So we share a commitment to building inclusion and equity in our learning environments, to the integration of critical information literacy in instruction, reference, and research services, and in guiding our colleagues to rethink expectations and goals of our work using critical pedagogy. We also lead in aligning our library's instructional approaches to various critical frameworks. We engage in campus-wide outreach to support and build upon anti-racism work. And then through curriculum development, professional development, and internal training, we foster the culture and application of critical pedagogy to support others who teach. And all of our work connects to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within our libraries and across our campuses.
So there are some key events that we think have led to the emergence of our positions within the field, beginning with 2010 with the publication of Critical Library Instruction, which is a book that was edited by Accardi, Drabinski, and Cumbie. And it's an early intervention in critical approaches to librarianship and LIS. And then in 2016, there was the first CLAPS conference, which is the Critical Librarianship and Pedagogy Symposium, which is also is held biannually by University of Arizona. And then in 2019, we see the emergence of the first critical pedagogy librarian position, which is currently held by Emily Drabinski at CUNY Graduate Center. And then 2020 is a unique year where we're seeing increased emphasis on the Black Lives Matter movement and more attention being paid to systemic racism and racial injustices. And this was happening alongside of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these two together are often referred to as twin or dual pandemics. And they created basically what you might call a perfect storm, where a lot of people were dialed into what was happening at this time, and a lot of protests happening as well around these certain issues. And also, I would say it was kind of like created a captive audience of everyone, right? Because everyone's at home, kind of watching TV and news and all of that. And so this was definitely a unique year and pivotal, I would say, also for our positions and kind of this emergence of these critical pedagogy positions, which we start to see a lot of in 2021, right? And I also want to take this time to actually highlight the role that Sean Smith-Cruz plays in the emergence of these positions, as she actually had a hand and a role in creating two of the positions, the one at CUNY as well as NYU, but also she was consulted in the creation of my position at Harvard.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So we don't know if this position will continue to proliferate across our institutions, across the nation, or even wider than that. Even in the past 2 years, the political landscape has obviously changed a lot, and there's a lot of pushback against this kind of work. But for institutions that do create these positions, there are some potential impacts of adding a critical pedagogy librarian. First, that it establishes a functional or sort of subject specialist that is internal to the library and external to other academic units regarding critical pedagogy. It signals a sort of priority for the library, whether that priority be performative, like it absolutely could be, but does sort of signal a priority of perhaps diversity, equity, inclusion, perhaps racial justice, perhaps all kinds of things that the library wants to suggest that they support. The position does reduce the need for subversive criticality in our work. We know that there's a lot of folks who integrate critical pedagogy into their work, but they have to do it quietly. They have to do it in a way that's not ever so obvious. And much of us were doing that prior to having these positions. In order to do my job, I cannot do it quietly. And so we reduce that need. But finally, like any other sort of non-traditional, I don't even know what a traditional position in librarianship is, but a position like this does run the risk of concentrating expertise in one person and allowing others in the library to evade progress. And so that's something we have to keep an eye on. So now that we've told you really quickly what we're doing and how we got here and a large overview of what our work looks like, we're going to move into a portion of our talk where we're going to utilize some of these critical race theory tenets. The way that we're going to work is that we will read the definition of the 6 tenets that we chose, just in case any of these are new to folks who are in the room. And then we're going to sort of muse upon how the tenet relates to our research, teaching, and practice. We have elected to use definitions of these tenets that come from the book Knowledge Justice, the introduction, which was written by Sophia and Jorge. We think just does a really excellent job of synthesizing the work of critical race theorists across the disciplines and informing what these tenets are and how they function. And so we're going to use their definition. So thank you so much, Sophia and Jorge. We have included in the references slide of this slide deck a link to the open access version of that text, should you like to take a look. And I'm going to hand it over to Jamila to get us started.
Okay, so the first tenet that we will be discussing is interest convergence. And this definition reads, Derek Bell presented this principle in his article, Brown v. Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Dilemma, stating, interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. Thus, whites' self-interests motivate their participation or not in racial justice and will not eliminate racism or their dominance. That is to say, marginalized people's racial justice interests are considered only when they converge with the interests of powerful whites. Going further, Bell suggests that if a racial remedy does actually materialize, it will be abrogated at the point that policymakers fear the remedial policy is threatening the superior societal status of whites, particularly those in the middle and upper classes. And so we really believe that this particular tenet is the foundation for the creation of many of our positions, if not all. And I would say in my position in particular came about because the Graduate School of Education started to revamp some of their master's programs, and they wanted to increase emphasis on critical pedagogy within the discipline in their programs. And as a result, Gutman Library and the librarians and the dean there, or the director there, decided to create this position in support of that endeavor within the school. So if anyone else has other examples they'd like to share as well around interest convergence, this would be the time.
I'll just pop in to say that, like Jamila mentioned before, Sean is my supervisor. She's my assistant dean. And when she came to NYU, she knew she wanted to bring this position over. She was integral in the creation of it at CUNY. And she capitalized on sort of the sort of reckoning, I guess, that NYU was realizing. I don't know if you've ever read like the racial demographics of the faculty at NYU, it's not great. And so the institution was deciding that they needed to do something about it. And she capitalized on that moment to get the funding for this position. But like, if that's not interest convergence, I don't know what is. And so it works out for me, I guess. But
and I'll say that, you know, my position came about, I think maybe a little more organically, in that so I was already doing this work before my title changed. So I came in as a health sciences librarian, that was my title. And what happened was my supervisors, they recognized that, like, you know, I had a real interest in this kind of work and was already doing it. And so they approached me about, you know, making this title change to Critical Pedagogy and Research Librarian. And that, you know, recognizing that this was an area that we could use some like more focused leadership and direction in. At the same time, though, this was happening during the same period of kind of consciousness raising that was happening, you know, around the murder of George Floyd. And my institution was committing itself to becoming an anti-racist institution. So I think, you know, all of those kind of interests converged together at that point, which was interesting. I'll also say on this interest convergence that, you know, it indicates that we are limited in how radical our practice can be. So our positions are not going to like eliminate racism or white dominance in the university, right? As it states here, you know, marginalized people's racial justice interests are considered only when they converge with the interests of powerful whites. And then once those interests diverge, racial remedies will not materialize. So I think it's important to like recognize the name the constraints that are going to be inherent in doing this work in the context of the neoliberal university.
are we good to go, Robin? I'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I will quickly add on to what Tova said, that sort of, well, I work at one library of many libraries, and while I have the freedom to work very openly and not be subversive within my own unit, I have found that projects that affect the university libraries as a whole and their reputation as an entire institution have sometimes been stymied, and subversion is still necessary in some of those cases when you bring the bigger institution in.
Absolutely. Okay, so our next tenet is the critique of dominant ideologies. Defined as a central tenet of CRT is the challenging of dominant ideologies like colorblindness, objectivity, neutrality, meritocracy. These claims frequently are used as disguises for the dominant group and their structures to push forward their interests, thus reproducing and extending their power in harmful systems of domination. And I think that this is one of the critiques that aligns really well with the critique of DEI work in libraries in general, right? That sort of the scopus of work around DEI, as Dave very, very well illustrated for us, tends to be this sort of very liberal version of diversity. I do think it's interesting, if anything, that our job descriptions do attempt to do this thing where it goes beyond DEI, much like Dave said, sort of this spicier version, right? Where our job descriptions explicitly mention words like racism, anti-racism, critical race theory, queer theory, feminism, oppression, white supremacy, gender-based oppression, decolonial theory. And we're asked to help our colleagues integrate these ideas into our teaching and pedagogy. But of course, like Tova was mentioning before, there are limitations to this, right? We're not decolonizing anything. Our institutions are not doing land back, you know? So we are up against sort of the dominant ideologies as well.
Yeah, and I think that with, following what you were saying, Symphony, just also, within our, probably in all of our work, comes this kind of explicit critique and rejection, right, of neoliberalism, neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, meritocracy. And I know I do that in my work, in my teaching with the health sciences students. And again, trying to do this work as much as possible, right, within these kind of constraints that we've already articulated.
I think also in doing this work of critique, that it's important to honor ideas that come from alternative ways of knowing, that are looking towards minoritarian thought and marginalized perspectives. And in those ways and in those kinds of ideas and theories are, I think, equip us with the tools to really critique in ways that other types of theories would not.
Yeah, my work is strongly influenced by queer theory, and within that challenging norms like cisgenderism and heteronormativity. And so I was drawn to the position I have because I was already writing about specifically transgender inclusion as well as Indigenous inclusion or lack thereof in library spaces. And so sort of, as you were saying, Jamila, honoring those alternative ways of knowing and communicating and thinking.
Okay, so our next tenet is experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So Long and Lopez McKnight contextualized this tenet like this. Because the experiences and knowledge of BIPOC historically have been and continue to be ignored and erased, white people have little idea of what it's like to be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, nor do they often understand the value of BIPOC experiences and knowledge. CRT contends that these experiences and knowledge are necessary and crucial to moving us to eradicating multiple oppressions. So just to kind of start us off, so for me, I think it's interesting to think about how we are a majority Black group, and all of us, even if not Black, occupy marginalized or minoritized identities in some way or another. And I think it's interesting to think about how our own experiences and knowledge like intersect with our work. I think my interest in critical pedagogy and critical race theory is not entirely like coincidental to my own social position as a Black woman who grew up in a like really low income family. So I can also speak to my students, you know, my colleagues, et cetera, from a place of like personal experience and knowledge. And I come to this work from like the inside, if that makes sense. I'll also add that, you know, our work involves also educating ourselves on the experiences and knowledge of BIPOC communities that we may not be a part of. So for example, to learn more about like Indigenous experiences and knowledge, I enrolled in We Here's community study of Indigenous lifeways and liberation. And I've been able to apply what I learned through that community study to my own work in teaching, such as getting students to recognize that there are alternative ways of knowing, such as like Indigenous knowledge. And then finally, I just want to add that in my teaching, I share articles by Black, Indigenous, and people of color that articulate, you know, their own experiences that touch on some aspect of critical information literacy. So for example, I share a video of Dr. Sophia Noble's talk on the algorithms of oppression and her experiences searching Google. And then also I share an article on Indigenous authors who study Indigenous issues being told to like cite white male authors in their work. So again, you know, hearing from BIPOC folks themselves about their own experiences is important, I think.
So I would add that, at least for my perspective on this, I definitely lean heavily on my culture, and I also have a background in Black studies, and so much of what I'm using in my research, in my teaching, as well as in practice, is coming from the Black radical tradition, as well as Black feminist thought, and as well as influenced by Indigenous thought as well, and how I can incorporate those things into all aspects of my work. And that's working with faculty and working with students as well, bringing some of those things to the forefront if they haven't thought about it or haven't considered some of these other scholars in their teaching and in their study as well. But it's really integral to all of the work that I'm doing, and bringing in scholars that are, as Tova has mentioned, not only Black scholars, but scholars that represent other backgrounds as well, and bringing those in a way that they kind of feed off of each other and help each other, and bringing in kind of these like ideas that sometimes that emerge in different ways in different cultures, which I think is an interesting thing as well, as when we're seeing some of the same kinds of ideas that are coming up in different ways that also complement each other.
I think it was yesterday, probably during Dave's talk, Teresa Helena Moreno noted in the chat that so many of the questions or answers that we hope to seek out about what race or whatever can be found in ethnic studies, in the work of these other departments, right? That are not librarianship, or that are not all these other disciplines in which we help to support. And yet the work of those people are often like ignored in the work of these other disciplines, right? People who are writing about diversity and equity and inclusion, but they're not actually citing the work that comes out of ethnic studies, which is really interesting. And Teresa has said that many times in lots of different symposiums that I've been a part of, and she's right every single time. But like as an example of one of the ways that I've been trying to do this better. Like as soon as I've heard her, probably 3 years ago, I heard her say that and I was like, yeah, duh. Like, and so just earlier this semester, I was working with a master's of social work student who was studying diversity initiatives in masters of social work programs. And she had already done an immense amount of work. She's putting together a literature review, and every single citation came out of a social work journal. These journals that she had been told were important were the places where she was supposed to be finding information about her field, but completely ignored all of the work, any journal at all, that is supposed to be about either ethnic studies, diversity, race, or anything like that. And so in our research consultation together, that's what we talked about. Like she had her area covered, her discipline covered, but she did not have this entire other space of study covered at all. And when she starts reading and getting into all of this other stuff, she realizes that there's a huge gap in her literature review. And I think that that is what all of our disciplines should be noticing, that there's this huge gap in their own studies of diversity, equity, inclusion, because they're not citing these other people, this other work that exists. And so I think I have realized that a lot of my work inside of this position is making those things visible, making them obvious to the researchers, to the faculty, to the students who are reaching out to me, that these other things can and should also be noted and used and cited, right? We cite Black women, right? Like we need to, but like sometimes they need to be ushered into that. And as a librarian, I can do that if their instructors are not.
Right, so intersectionality is a lens through which we can locate overlapping oppressions in the intersecting social divisions of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, and citizenship to better understand how power operates in a society and creates social inequality. It is a framework that provides a bridge between identity politics and coalition building through which change can be enacted. So our positions should, in theory, offer us the freedom to do critical, radical work, but intersectionality can also complicate what that looks like. So an example is some colleagues and I recently faced censorship over a research guide we created on trans rights. The objections to the guide largely framed it as a partisan issue, and thus it was considered separate from issues such as race or class or even sexuality. And you really can't understand power and inequality if you separate these identities, and nor is it productive to do so. You know, you cannot, for example, talk about the history of gay rights without talking about the fact that those struggles were spearheaded by trans women of color. And, you know, as David Hudson said in his excellent keynote yesterday, fighting racial oppression is about how we, all of us, are getting fucked over by the ruling class. And so I think critical race theory gives us this framework for critiquing how intersectionality shows up or fails to show up in our workplace. In my outreach work, I am currently focusing on improving library services for first-generation students. And one of the reasons why I chose to focus on first-gen students is because their identities often intersect with other groups that are historically underserved by the library. And so the services we can provide them can also meet the needs of these students with intersecting identities and connect us to a wider network of student services across the university.
I think to go along with this tenet, I think our jobs can help others to recognize the lack of intersectionality in their own work. You know, when I'm working with students and faculty and researchers otherwise, if they're coming to me, it's usually because they know that this critical pedagogy thing exists in my title, and they're interested in these issues of race and sexism and class and whatever. And it empowers me to point out their gaps, which is probably criticism that sometimes they're not interested in or looking for. But that, like, if you're going to come to me, I can make that clear. I have recently, or I guess sort of this at the start of my position, I was introduced to a researcher, a professor in the Masters of Social Work program, who is studying intersectional interventions to intersectional like oppression and prejudice. So he's like trying to find evidence-based sort of clinical interventions for like fixing, I guess, a person who is like racist, sexist, and ageist. Like, how do we hit all of those things at the same time? And in working with him and his graduate research assistants, like, the literature does not exist. Like there is almost nothing that attempts out of, and this is psychology, sociology, social work, in the fields in which he's looking, right? And in this like sect of literature that he wanted to narrow his research to, it didn't exist. And so his research assistants are really frustrated because they think it should exist and it doesn't exist. They have to write what doesn't exist, of course. That's an opportunity. But also that gives me the opportunity to, one, be like, hey, there's also ethnic studies, right? But two, to be like, you're going to have to provide a critique of your discipline. You're going to have to provide a critique of the fact that there is no intersectional analysis in these sorts of interventions. And you can do that through this critical race theory lens. Like, if you don't have the language to help you with that, then perhaps CRT can help you with the language to do that kind of critique. And so I feel like I see my work a lot of the times as pointing these things out, and maybe even perhaps giving students the permission to use them, or in this case, to force their professor to use them in his research because they were research assistants.
I would just reiterate what Robin and Symphony have already, I think, stated very eloquently already. But kind of just to sum up, that intersectionality is something that is applied in multiple ways, right? So we're looking at these intersecting oppressions and how we interact with our students, because they come to us with these issues already, as well as how we interact with them and what we bring to the table as well. And so that's something to be thinking about in our how we help our students. But then also, how are we interacting with faculty and bringing like intersectional research to the forefront, and suggesting when allowed, that is, because some of us can have tenuous relationships with faculty as librarians, right? So there's already kind of a power dynamic that's existing when it comes to not only faculty, but also we're working with students, right? So we're having to think about all of these different things as we come to the table to talk about research and teaching and whatnot. And I think that intersectionality is something that emerges in many different ways. And we have to think about those different ways and what that can mean for both ourselves and the people that we are interacting with. So our next tenet is interdisciplinary. As legal scholars, Matsuda and colleagues put forward in their original formation of CRT, and Yasso and colleagues include in the field of education, the framework pushes for the embracement of theories and methodologies from various academic disciplines and intellectual approaches. This flexibility allows for a more thorough examination of racial domination, both currently and historically, with the aim to more forcefully advance racial justice. It also implies that CRT is meant to be applied across disciplines, that the boundaries between disciplines are falsely constructed barriers. With this particular tenet, I think that we have to kind of, I think that it's obvious that it's applicable to more than one discipline at this point. And although CRT emerged within the law field, we're seeing CRT being applied to many different areas. In my field that I work in, which is education, there is definitely a strong background and history of CRT being applied to education. Scholars such as Adrian Dixon are instrumental in building that research, that body of research and work around that area. I first came to, I would say, criticality in general, but also CRT through my studies as a PhD student in information science and wanting to apply that to information science and seeing a lack of research and studies that, was doing that. And so Knowledge Justice and the publication of that book really has turned that around, I would say. And obviously there have been some scholars who have already been writing in applying CRT to LIS, but now we're seeing kind of like a critical turn in that area. And then this is just, I'm really specifically talking about information and education, but again, CRT is being applied in many different disciplines and areas. And so it, while what maybe was not meant to be applied in those areas initially, it definitely is applicable in so many different ways because of our I would say our identities and the fact that we come from so many different areas and places and perspectives that there's definitely applicability in so many different ways.
Yeah, I'll also build on that and say, and I think that our positions as critical pedagogy librarians are like a manifestation of how critical race theory is being applied to libraries, right? So the fact that it's being formalized in this kind of way, which I think is exciting. So I also add that in terms of this, so, and Symphony was talking about this earlier, but so in order to get, students to think critically about like race and racism, right, and how it applies to their disciplines in the health sciences. Again, those are the students that I teach. I kind of like have to point them toward work that's being done in other disciplines, like, sociology and philosophy, just because not as much as has been done like in the science realm around this. So, so it's interdisciplinary in that way. And so, for example, in the courses that I teach and co-teach, I assign readings. For example, there's this article from Venkatesh Vaditya, published in 2018. It's called Social Domination and Epistemic Marginalization Towards a Methodology of the Oppressed. It was published in a journal called Social Epistemology. So, we assign these to the students and it prompts them to reflect on like the non-neutrality of Western science and exclusion of indigenous knowledge and like other ways of knowing and experiencing the world, right? So I think this plays like a major kind of, role in terms of how I do this work, right? That it has to be interdisciplinary. And yeah, it's just interesting to see, students who have been sort of, I guess, socialized into, science and how it's supposed to be, neutral and objective and all of this. And then sort of exposing them to this other literature, right, that really complicates the ways in which they think about and engage with science.
Yeah, I have similar experiences to you, Tova, of working with a lot of majors within life science and agriculture, because there's also a bit of a dearth of information that is specifically about racism within those fields. I do often work with introductory classes that have a wide range of different majors, so you do sort of I get a little bit of that interdisciplinary flavor from the students themselves, but I do try to get them to think critically about how Western science is impacted by social epistemology, and often that does mean pulling in readings from like philosophy and social sciences, but also trying to pull in readings from that are about Indigenous knowledge and things like that.
And then for our final tenant, we could have done all 9 or all of the ones, but this is the final one that we'll talk about today, is this focus on historical contexts. For our definition, CRT scholars argue that in order to understand what is happening in the current moment, we must look to history and examine the particular historical, social, and economic contexts that led to this point. Those contexts are what allow us to identify and comprehend the underlying instructional and systemic issues. Without that understanding, we will not be able to develop the necessary interventions. And when I think about this tenet, I think about truth telling, that we tell students why things are the way they are instead of telling them that things are just the way they are, because that's how they've always been done. Just not this week, last week, the days are running together. Just last week, I was working with a student who was doing an author study of this anti-colonial, anti-war writer from 1850s India. And this student could read in many languages, very, very, very talented, could read in Hindi and some of the others. And he was expecting that he'd have just this really wide amount of stuff to read because he could read across languages, but he's doing his research using these sort of Western systems, right? Our research databases, the internet, whatever. We're doing it from, in this case, from New York. And it was really obvious that our location was interrupting his research. That if we were someplace else, he'd probably find more, because this was supposed to be a really important writer. He was really, really shocked. And of course, we were like, that sucks, because it sucks, right? But students want to be told the truth, right? Students want us to acknowledge when something is wrong, right? We've all been in situations where we're listening to somebody talk and we're like, that's messed up. That doesn't seem right. And then it's just glossed over like it is the way that it is. And so in my work, I try really hard to be like, this is why this is happening. We are seeing a Western bias in your search results. Like we just have to say it out loud. But I think that in other versions of our work, other eras of our work of librarianship, that kind of thing wouldn't have been noted, wouldn't have been explained, wouldn't have been, truth told. And so I think with embedding sort of CRT into my work, it reminds me to tell the truth, or it reminds me to note these things. I'm also thinking about when I taught high school for a long time. And I was a high school English teacher at a suburban, large school district. 90% of our students were white. It's a very interesting place to teach. And we basically had this rule of neutrality. I was not to express my political beliefs to students. which is a whole thing, right? But I tried really hard to make it a point to tell the truth, right? It's not my opinion, right? If it's the truth. But also to share like experiences. And so when I was doing my work when I was a teacher, I had to be subversive in that work, like so many of us are having to be. And I'm thinking about the last year I taught during Poetry Month, which is April. We didn't have like a poetry unit for ninth graders for this ninth grade class I taught. We were actually reading Shakespeare at the time. But twice a week, we would read a poem. Students are not taught to enjoy poetry. It's a problem because we like analyze it and they have to write about it. So the goal of my month was just that we were going to like let poems affect us. We're just going to read the poem and then we'd have a moment of silence. And if students wanted to say something, they would say something. And if not, we'd go into our Shakespeare unit, like just to feel it. But what they didn't know is that every single poem we read together was by an author of some sort of a marginalized identity. And the themes of those poems were all over the place. We're about everything and, at all. And they didn't know that was the goal, but that was the goal. And as a part of truth telling about seeing stories, the experiences of BIPOC, showing how things are happening for other people and just letting it affect them.
I think that this is a really important tenet for our students. And this reminds me of an initiative that I'm working on now with the Solidarity Collective for Black Lives Matter here within the Grad School of Education. And that collective came together and created this list of scholars and articles that focus on BIPOC writers and that are anti-deficit, that are looking at things critically. And I think that a lot of what students are getting in their classes, it kind of just glosses over a lot of this historical context, social and economic context. And so there is a need for us to address that, right? And to kind of figure out how to get these kinds of articles and research to the students because they are thirsty for it. And some of them don't even know that. Some are aware, but others are not, right? And so I think that this initiative really allowed us to kind of bring in scholars that were not being used within the classroom and that were not, that represent the gaps that are in these in the coursework within these contexts. And so part of creating this list was also promoting it, right? And doing information literacy around using these kinds of scholars, how to find them. And Symphony kind of mentions also like the difficulty of trying to find scholarship that falls in the gaps, right? Because our systems, our databases don't give us the tools to find these people easily, right? And so students are asking, and as well as faculty are asking for this kind of research, and it's so difficult to find because of the way our systems are built, and also because of the fact that they're not being taught in classes. And these alternative, perspectives, these other contexts that are not being offered to students, they're only getting part of the history, right? They're only getting a certain segment of context that doesn't address everyone and leaves out a whole margin of people. And so this focus on historical context, I think is really, even though we're talking about it last, is really very, very important in terms of how we are servicing and providing resources for our students, our faculty, et cetera.
Yeah, so I'll just piggyback off with what you all are saying. And I like this framing, Symphony, of like, facilitating students' understanding of like why things are the way they are, right? So again, one example I can think of is, again, referencing that 2018 Vidya article that I talked about earlier from the Journal of Social Epistemology. So it helps them to put, Western science like into context, right? Into a historical context, like how it evolved, why we have the paradigms that we have today, right? To the exclusion of other epistemologies and ways of knowing. Another way in which I think about this tenet is in terms of, knowledge organization systems. So, we want to get them to think that, searching tools and like knowledge organization systems, right, are not natural, right? And so, for example, in the classes that I teach, so we look at how medical subject headings or mesh terms in the database PubMed have changed and continue to change like over time. Sometimes there's forward progress and sometimes there's regression. So, it's interesting to have them kind of look at like what a term is called today and what it used to be called. So for example, the term like transgender persons, it's a more current term that's used to, identify articles that are about transgender people. But the term that used to be used to mark articles that are about that was transsexualism, right? So here we see like how a more offensive term has evolved and changed to a better, more acceptable term. But then we also look at like instances of where things have kind of regressed, because it's not always forward progression. So for example, the mesh term to refer to Black people, it was recently changed to Blacks, and it included the word Negro in the definition. And then there was this like outcry from library workers about this term and how it was changed. And this resulted in the National Library of Medicine actually changing the term to Black people, as opposed to just Blacks, and also like removing that derogatory reference to Negroes. And so it's interesting to like, look at how those things have evolved and changed over time. And again, to get students, realizing like, oh, like this is a changing thing. And, nothing about this is natural or neutral or objective in any way. So.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I hit the button too fast.
You're good. I was done.
So our final musings will go back to two of the questions that we started with. What does it mean to apply criticality and maybe even radicalism to our positions at neoliberal institutions? And how critical race theory can help, how does critical race theory help us make sense of our positions and critical pedagogy? And just to start us off, honestly, I think there is a limit to how radical we can actually get within a neoliberal institution, which is not to say that this work is futile, but change is a group project. It's bigger than what I can do as a single person at a single library. And so some of the tenets we discussed today help me make sense of what I'm doing, because they show that other people in other disciplines are also working on these wicked problems. And that's a reminder to me that this work happens in community, and neoliberal institutions love to glorify the individual, and that, we try to push back against that by centering community. And the students I work with are also interested in asking these questions. They want to learn how to ask critical questions. So I really see my role as helping them to do that and to, pull back the curtain on why things are the way they are and how things function today, so that they can ask these questions.
I'll just quickly add, because I think Robin said a lot of what I was thinking, but at our institutions, our students are being consistently prepared to be a part of, to work in, and to believe in a capitalist society, right? Like if you think about their econ classes and poli-sci and business class, a student could take an entire business degree and never take a class that centers labor as a worker issue. It's like that's absolutely ridiculous, right? I think it is only appropriate that our students are also introduced to criticality, and so I'm happy to be here doing that. I was thinking that the neoliberal institution wants it all, right? Like wants to be the real estate mogul, but also wants to be the DEI, the pinnacle of DEI, right? So I might as well just take advantage of that wish to do it all. If they're going to do it all, well, then they're going to do it too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with everything that you all have already stated. So yeah, so even though, you know, these positions are not going to like free us from racism or white dominance, as we said, that we need something much more radical to do that. What we can do is like push as much as we can, right, within these positions, using the mandate that we have and standing on that mandate and saying, well, this is what you hired me to do when there is pushback, right? To at least like raise the racial consciousness of the folks that we teach and that we work with and engage with. And so I feel like critical race theory, it gives us a framework through which to engage folks in this conscientization process that Freire talks about, you know, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And despite the constraints around, you know, what we can do, I feel like this work is worth it. Because of this kind of consciousness raising. You know, when students say that, my students say like they're going to commit themselves to reducing like racial and other biases in the sciences, or that they're going to engage in more inclusive citational practices, right? And seek out the work of BIPOC folks. Like, I feel like, okay, yeah, like this is worth it, you know, so.
So criticality and theories such as CRT allow us to dig deeper and to interrogate the systems we are intrinsically part of, and to encourage those around us to do the same. I also am definitely influenced by Moten and Harney's Undercommons, and it has really provided this outlook on how I operate within academia and within libraries. I think there are certainly limitations to how radical one can be when working within the confines of hegemonic institutions and systems. But I would say not to underestimate the power of subversive acts and the impact that they can have.
So I think at this point we're ready for questions. I know that there's a lot of questions already. I think I'll stop sharing my slides so that the screen is a little less encumbered, but I just wanted to note that at the end of our slide deck, I'll put it in the chat again, are some of the links and the things that were referenced today. When we spoke at CLAPS, we also put together a reading list of texts that guide our research, teaching, and practice. It was compiled by the amazing Christina Bush, who is also a critical pedagogy librarian at American University. So that list is also there along with our contact information at the end of the slide. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that might be better.
Symphony, there was a question. We want to keep recording through the QA. Is that right?
I consent.
Okay, cool. All right, so this was amazing. We had 300, I saw the number go as high as 310 participants, which is awesome. And we have already 10 juicy questions, so I don't know how many we'll get through by the end, but I will do my best to keep us on track. So I'll go in order of received. Do you see the use of a critical pedagogy librarian at a small liberal arts institution?
can actually start us off there. Prior to being at NYU, I was at American University, which is not a liberal arts. It's like an R2. It's like this liberal arts institution that could. And there I, along with amazing colleagues there like Hannah Park, tried to do a lot of critical information literacy work. As in, I held like faculty learning communities and things like that would introduce this idea of critical information work to faculty across the disciplines. So my participants weren't just other librarians, although my colleagues did participate in my learning communities, but I would also see folks from I don't know, math and religion and geography, and I don't know, these folks who were interested in the topic, lots of writing folks. And they really loved the conversations, they loved the experience, they loved being sort of exposed to this work of interrogating our information systems and our participation within them. And so to answer that question, I think yes. Like I think that this position can work any place that is, of course, amenable to it.
Thanks. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in on that one?
I would just say that I think a critical pedagogy librarian would be useful at any institution where there's teaching and learning. And that's all you need, really, is that if there's teaching and learning happening, then you can do a CPL and it will be useful and beneficial for everyone.
I'm going to jump out of sequence just because there's a related question, which was, do you all know how many critical pedagogy librarians there are in the US total? And do you know if there are any or how many in other countries?
We believe that there are just 6 of us here in the US, and I don't know of any overseas. I don't know if anybody.
Great, thank you. Next up, the reduction in need for subversive criticality with the creation of your roles also hints at concentration of attention on the people occupying those roles. Excuse me, how are you all doing and how are you navigating that?
So I'll say for me that, luckily, like my supervisors in our department is really like this is not all on you, right? Like everybody, all of the librarians and everybody are supposed to be engaged in this work. So, and I think that's really important. Like if anyone is, thinking of like creating this kind of position, right, that it not be on just the critical pedagogy librarian. So, so luckily, because of that, it's been a really for me a good experience, and I think everybody understands like this is all our work. So
that's great.
I think that there is a lot of support for my position where I am, which is great, and I'm definitely thankful for that. I do think there's still a bit of scrutiny in terms of, the creation of the position. Is it really necessary? Is it needed? There are still some people who might be thinking that or feel that way. And I think also just me personally, I feel that there is some pressure in terms of performing and proving, that this position is necessary.
Anyone else on this one?
I just will say that I think that there is sometimes this sense of like, okay, we have created this position. This is your job now. We're done. We don't have to keep doing that work. And that sort of has been the state of, DEI initiatives in general. And so that is something that can be challenging. I have not experienced that a ton at my institution. People are very engaged for the most part in actually doing that work, but there is still you can encounter some of that sense of like, oh, okay, we're done now.
Great, thank you. All right. Next up, how do you all deal with recognizing the neoliberal respectability politics that come with academia while also trying to stay true to your radical selves?
So I kind of lean on both. This is what you hired me to do, and a little on my own like identity as a neurodivergent person of this is, you know, if there's going to be a respectability politics, or if someone's going to push back on what I'm doing, I kind of just like, there's a little bit of in general of like, what is this social cue? But I kind of just lean into that of like, what do you mean? I'm doing what you hired me to do. So what's the problem?
I would also add that when I decided to switch careers, it was because I was feeling really stifled in my first career. And I just sort of promised myself that like I wasn't going to do it anymore. And so I hope that my colleagues feel like they know me, that I'm bringing my full self to work. I hope that my students feel like they know me. And I try very hard to be me, and me as a person who is a little rough. Sometimes I'm gonna cuss a little bit. I have a terrible anxiety disorder. I can be a little, you know, my attention can be all over the place. I don't sleep at night. I don't know, like there's like all of these things, and I bring them to work. And I think that, I don't know, I guess everybody else is just dealing with it. They have trouble.
I think it's similar for me, Symphony, and you know, like I speak up, like, you know, when I think something is wrong, or and yeah, I guess the chips just gonna fall where they may. But I think that sometimes, you know, now when I'm thinking about like teaching and that kind of thing, and I think there's still some of this like having to be a little subversive too, like we talked about, and you know, trying to maybe get folks to understand like where their interests or their students' interests, right, are aligned with whatever it is that we're trying to do or teach. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jamila, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would probably add that, or really reiterate that point that Symphony makes about bringing your full self to the position, to the job. And that's something I think that I have to work on daily. Like it's something that I have to actively do. And but also what Robin said about, you hired me to do this, right? And so I think there's a little bit of maybe not complete abandon, but some of that is there, that feeling of like, I'm going to tell it how it is and say what the deal is, because that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what my job is, but also that's just who I am. And so that's going to come out regardless. And I have to temper that sometimes as well, because I want to stay employed, right? But this is probably the first job where I'm actually being asked to do that, you know, at least to a certain extent. And I enjoy that. So it can be a tenuous position though, right? And it's something we have to navigate every day.
And I just want to jump in and say that, like, I feel like we all, not even just us in this little panel, but like all of us should be able to also not be our full selves at work if we don't want to. Like we have the power to be who we want to be at work. And that it's not okay when folks try to get you to share more than you want to. We need for people to feel safe. And so I just want to point that out, and also that professionalism is bullshit.
I think, yes, I think that's a great point. Thanks for pointing that out, Symphony. I think also being vulnerable and honest invites other people to also be vulnerable. You know, Bell Hooks talks about in her teaching about in her writing about teaching that she doesn't ask students to share being vulnerable with themselves unless she is also willing to do that first. And that's sort of the thing of like talking about, you know, anxiety disorders or being a mess, like that also gives other people space to feel comfortable being a mess if they want to bring that. You know, like I'm the newest member of this group, and I started my position last August, and I think one of our first or second meetings, you all asked like, how's it going? And I said, I don't feel like I really know, I'm still figuring out what I'm even doing. And I think all of you were like, oh yeah, our first year, it was the same way. And I was like, okay, I'm not doing this wrong.
Yes, definitely within our group, I think that it allows us to be vulnerable in ways that we might not necessarily can be outside of this, right? In other circles. So I'm definitely grateful for the Critical Pedagogy Librarianship group that we have here.
Yeah, I completely agree. This has been a really supportive, being able to, you know, commiserate with you all and interact has been great. So
it's nice that we get a little window into it also. So thank you for sharing your sharing. The next question is more practical. Can you share ways of identifying scholarship by BIPOC authors? I can teach how voices are marginalized. There are other authors of color within traditional scholarship, but how do we find them or in or out of traditional sources?
I think that there's a lot of work, obviously, that goes into this because it's not an easy 1, 2, 3 kind of situation. And so it means like finding authors that you may already be aware of, and then kind of looking at who else is publishing in that field or that discipline, that area. A lot of those BIPOC authors are citing other BIPOC authors, and so you're looking through citations and references to find those and see who is citing who. So it's a lot of legwork, right, in order to do that, because we can't just rely on our databases to just pull it up, you know, and we can't just type in BIPOC author and it's going to pop up. Unfortunately, I wish that were the case. And maybe that's something we should be advocating for as well in terms of people who are developing these search engines and databases. But that's something that is missing from that. So it means that we have to do the work of really trying to locate where those people are and who's talking to who, and then kind of like extrapolating from there. So I wish I had an easy step-by-step guide for doing it, but it does, it is possible to find these people and to, you know, if we put in the work to find them, we can. And of course, it's not easy. It's difficult. There's still going to be people that we miss, that we don't know of, you know, and maybe talking with our colleagues who also have some knowledge of scholars in their particular fields or disciplines and that kind of thing, and commiserating with others to find the resources, but also looking outside of just the databases, you know, and the traditional articles, because a lot of scholarship is happening outside of that, right? And so we need to be looking beyond just that journal article or that book.
yes. Sorry.
Very quick. I just saw in the chat someone said something about Twitter being a great place to find this. As shitty as aspects of it are, yes, but it is still great. There's hashtags like Black and STEM that I have found a lot of great scholars to follow through there. So finding niches through that are a great way too.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I was good. That's exactly what I was going to say as well. And, you know, and as Jamila was saying, looking even outside of databases. So like when we teach about like great literature and, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, search strategies, right, to try to get at information from like marginalized and underrepresented scholars. Also, when you're in a database, like we teach our students, like don't just stop at like the most highly cited articles, because the most privileged tend to be the most highly cited scholars, right? So not stopping there, but looking at some of the lower cited ones as well. And somebody put, I saw in the chat, so there's a couple of like LibGuides too around this that talk about, that give strategies. And one of them is that University of Minnesota guide, and there's another one I can't remember offhand, but yeah, there are some resources out there for doing this.
I also think it folds into our, authority is constructed and contextual. Like if we're teaching through a lens like from the framework or whatever, we have to like teach students or remind students and their faculty, of course, that they should be looking up the people who they're like, especially if they're like heavily citing somebody, like you should be like tracking them down, find that person's website, find that person's Twitter, find out everything else that they have written. If that person's going to be a large part of your citation list, it's going to be a large part, take up a lot of space inside of your writing, you need to know who that person is. And so like, even just practically, we can like remind students of that or teach them how to do that. I call it being creepy. We're going to find everything we can about this person.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Next up, you all mentioned bringing in yourselves and your identities into your CP work. Does it ever get exhausting? How do you set boundaries? What's something you wish others knew about this work? I'm most interested in the last question because we all want to know what we don't know, right? But I'll leave it to you all to answer.
Yes, it does get exhausting, I think. I think working in academia, working in librarianship as a person of color is exhausting in general. So you add this on top of it and you're tired. But I think that boundaries is an important thing. And we talk about this in our profession a lot, I think, in terms of like self-care and that kind of thing. That's definitely essential. And I also feel that we need to have diversions outside of our work. Work is not everything. We are, librarianship is not everything. Critical pedagogy is not everything. And there needs to be other things that we turn to and that bring us joy outside of this work, and that allow us to replenish ourselves in order to do the work. And so we should definitely be taking up other interests, hobbies, whatever it is that gets you through and helps you separate from what the work is, because we want to enjoy our lives and be whole people, right, outside of what the work is. So I guess in terms of what something I wish others knew about the work is that it's cool to enjoy what you do and to give 100% of whatever that is to the work, but at some point you have to cut that off and step away from it because it's not everything.
I think I would add that, like, I don't find many aspects of my work exhausting. Like, working with students is not exhausting to me. What's exhausting to me is like hoping to be promoted, hoping to keep my job indefinitely, hoping to make my ends meet. Living in a capitalist society is what's exhausting, not teaching research strategies. But I think all I want to do in this moment is just to recognize that, like, we're all doing this. Like, I think somebody said in the chat that their position is really similar to ours. It just has a different title. We're all doing work. So many of us are doing work in this way, and it is, and we should be supporting each other as whole people, right? Like, so even if not all of your colleagues are bringing their whole selves to work. They are whole people. And we should be just responsive of the fact that we know that they're a whole person, even if they're not talking about their kids and their parents and their health and their whatever. And that's, I just want to remind people that we're all just trying to live.
Yeah, I feel similar to Symphony in that it's not so much the work, the work that I find exhausting. And it really helps, like I said, that, there's an understanding that like all of this work doesn't fall on me as the critical pedagogy librarian. It's more like the other stuff, broader things and context in which I'm trying to do my work, and, policies coming down, from the institution and that kind of thing. It's like, wait, like, this is going to hurt like marginalized folks or whatever. So yeah, it's more kind of that other stuff that can get exhausting.
Yeah, I agree. It's not the, like, working with the students is what makes the other stuff worth it for me, but there is all the other stuff, and that's what really is exhausting. I think something I wish others knew about is like, it's better to do imperfect work than to not do it at all. I think that there's a lot of people who are very interested in doing this kind of work, but are scared that they don't know enough, and or that they're going to do something wrong. And I think that you have to start somewhere. Everybody has to start somewhere, and being open to trying things, being open to being corrected. As a white person, I try to be very aware of my positionality. And when, people tell me, hey, you should take a back seat, trying to intentionally take a back seat. And, but I would rather see someone trying and failing and trying again than not doing the work at all.
Thanks. I see we have 2 minutes. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question. And that is, so we'll do this as the last question. I am curious to know whether your positions exist in addition to a more traditional instruction coordinator or instruction librarian position. And if so, how cooperative or conflicting do you find the relationship between their work and yours? Or if your position is more of a doing more with less merge of instruction librarian and criticality. How is space and time created for the more critical and radical parts of your work?
So the way things are set up at my unit is that we have an entire instruction team, and I am part of that team. And kind of some of my work is also kind of providing support and helping to develop lesson plans and learning objects for other people on the team that have a critical bent that we can all utilize. So I think everyone who does instruction at my library, even if critical pedagogy is not in their title, this is something they're really interested in doing. So it's both. It kind of comes into everything that I do.
And I'll just say that I work for a big institution, and there are a lot of us. My department is relatively small. There's 6 people in my department, but we join forces with other folks like our reference department. Shout out to them. Lots of them are here. They're amazing. They're the best. I have really great colleagues, and we do split responsibilities in multiple ways. I do a lot of very traditional instruction. Like I do plenty of like database demonstration. I do plenty of, that kind of thing too. But I have a great supervisor who makes sure that I can have the time to do what I need to do.
I work with a reference team of librarians, and so we're all doing instruction, and we have some of us have different emphases that we cater to, mine being critical pedagogy. But I do think that the whole team shares an interest in in that topic, and so I also kind of lead staff learning around it, and kind of how we can integrate some of these things in our reference practice.
I don't really have that much to add, but just to say that, you know, I also have a very supportive supervisor to sort of make sure I'm not like overextending myself, right? And usually it's me, like, because I want to be involved in so many things, and so I have to pull myself back. But yeah.
Thanks so much to all of you. This was amazing. Thanks to everyone who's been able to stay on 2 minutes past 4.